put me in a nursing home for my own safety. Then I saw the security footage from the day I fell. The cruelest lies are not the ones we are told by others, but the ones we tell ourselves to keep the peace. And for 3 years, I had been telling myself a beautiful, elaborate lie that I was living with my family, when in fact, they were living off of me in a house that was still and had always been mine. It is a large, sturdy house, the kind my late husband and I built to be filled with the noise and chaos of generations. We paid off the mortgage a decade ago. Now it is filled with a different kind of noise, the sharp, brittle sound of my daughter-in-law Julia's sighs every time I move too slowly, and the heavy silence of my son Mark every time I ask for a small bit of help. They moved in temporarily after Mark lost his job, bringing my 2 grandchildren with them. I was grateful for the company then, but temporary became permanent. My house became their house. And I, the owner, slowly became the primary unpaid caregiver. I endured it, because what else is a grandmother to do? I endured the way they redecorated, replacing my warm, comfortable furniture with cold, minimalist pieces that felt like they belonged in a magazine, not a home. I endured the way they spoke to me, their voices laced with a weary patience, as if I were a difficult, long-term project they had reluctantly taken on. I endured it all for the sound of my grandchildren's laughter in the hallways, but my body has its own ledger, and it was beginning to tell me that the accounts were no longer balanced. The arthritis in my hands has grown worse, and my hip, the one the doctors keep an eye on now, screams in protest every morning. I knew I needed more help than a resentful daughter-in-law and a passive son were willing to provide. I had done the research. A qualified part-time caregiver would cost approximately $300-200 a month. It was a significant sum, but well within my means. My husband had left me with a portfolio worth just over $1.1 million, a fact my children were conveniently unaware of. I was not a poor woman. I was simply an aging one. When I presented this plan to them, offering to pay for my own care with my own money, the look on Julia's face was not one of relief. It was one of pure, undisguised horror. They left me in the living room, their refusal hanging in the air like a verdict. I was to be cared for by them, not because they loved me too much to let a stranger do it, but because my money, I now understood, was more valuable to them than my well-being. It is a profoundly lonely feeling to be a prisoner of someone else's financial plans in your own home, isn't it? As I share this story with you, I find myself wondering where you might be listening from. It would bring me a small measure of comfort to know where my voice has landed. If you have a moment, please leave a comment and consider subscribing to Grannystories to hear the rest of my tale. But I endured it. I endured it for Leo and Maya, my grandchildren. They were my reason for staying, my reason for swallowing the sighs and the sharp glances. I would watch Leo meticulously build his Lego castles on the living room floor. I would help Maya practice her letters at the kitchen table, her small hand warm in mine. These were the moments of pure, uncomplicated love that I told myself were worth the price of my own comfort. They were islands of joy in an ocean of quiet resentment. I would swallow any amount of bitterness for a few more years of their bedtime stories and clumsy, wonderful hugs. I told myself that my love for them was a shield strong enough to protect me from anything. I had no way of knowing then that the greatest danger was not the daily simmering resentment, but the carefully laid trap that was waiting for me at the top of the stairs. My offer to pay for my own care was not met with gratitude. It was met with a quiet, simmering fury. By claiming I had the financial means to solve my own problem, I had inadvertently revealed to them that their access to my money was not guaranteed. The atmosphere in the house, which had been tense for months now, became openly hostile. Julia's sighs were louder. The doors seemed to close with a little more force. Small kindnesses disappeared entirely. My teacup would be left unwashed in the sink. My newspaper would be misplaced. They were small, petty rebellions, the actions of people who felt their control slipping. I saw it for what it was, a campaign of attrition designed to make my life so uncomfortable that any solution they proposed would feel like a mercy. I endured it. For Leo and Maya, I endured it. I told myself it was just a storm that would pass. I did not know that my daughter-in-law was not just waiting for the storm to pass. She was planning to create a hurricane. The morning it happened was a Thursday. I remember the light was particularly beautiful, streaming in through the living room windows and making dust motes dance in the air. I was coming down the main staircase, my hand trailing on the smooth, worn oak of the banister my husband had installed 40 years ago. I was moving slowly, as I always did in the mornings, my hip a chorus of dull aches. I remember noticing that the small Persian runner at the bottom of the stairs, the one that had been in that exact spot for decades, was slightly askew, bunched up in an unnatural way. I made a mental note to straighten it, but my mind was on the pot of oatmeal I needed to make for the children. My foot caught. It was that simple. My foot, the one on my weaker side, caught on the bunched-up rug. The world tilted violently. There was a sickening lurch, a moment of weightless terror, as my body tumbled forward, and then an explosion of white, hot, blinding pain in my hip as I hit the polished hardwood floor. The next thing I remember is Julia's face looming over me. But the look in her eyes was not the shock or the panic you would expect to see on the face of someone who has just witnessed a terrible accident. It was a look of something else, something cold, calm, and assessing. It was the look of a person checking to see if their plan had worked. In that moment, through the haze of my agony, I knew. I did not know how I knew, but I knew. This was not an accident. The hours that followed were a blur of choreographed concern. Mark was a flurry of panicked, useless activity, but Julia was a marvel of cold efficiency. She was the one who spoke to the paramedics in a calm, controlled voice. She was the one who told the emergency room doctor that I had been growing more and more unsteady, that she had been worried something like this would happen. She was painting a picture. I realized of a frail, confused old woman who could no longer be trusted to live safely in her own home. The diagnosis was a broken hip. Surgery was required. As I lay in the hospital bed, a prisoner of my own body, they came to me with glossy brochures. They had already found a place for me. A premier rehabilitation and convalescence center, Julia called it. The best in the state. She squeezed my hand, her touch cool and firm. "Don't you worry about a thing, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with a sympathy that now sounded like a threat. "It's no longer safe for you at home. We will take care of everything." They wheeled me out of the hospital and into the back of a medical transport van. Through the small square window, I saw my own house pass by its windows. Dark, the life inside it now entirely. Finally, theirs. I didn't know then about the security camera in the hallway, the one my husband had installed years ago. I didn't know that the proof of Julia's quiet, deliberate act of kicking the rug into a tangled heap was being silently recorded. All I knew was that I was being taken from my home, and the feeling was not one of being cared for. It was the feeling of being successfully, finally removed. The rehabilitation center was a masterpiece of benevolent imprisonment. The hallways were wide and spotless, the rooms were private, and there were cheerful, abstract paintings on every wall. It smelled of antiseptic and lilies, a combination I found deeply unsettling. My days became a monotonous, prescribed rhythm of physical therapy, tasteless, healthy meals, and long, silent hours spent staring out my window at a perfectly manicured garden I was not yet strong enough to walk in. This was the best care the place my daughter-in-law Julia had chosen for me. It was, I noted with a grim internal irony, incredibly expensive. My family's visits were brief and performative. They would arrive on a Sunday afternoon bearing a pot of orchids that had no scent, the children restless and bored. Julia would speak to the nurses in a loud, clear voice inquiring about my progress, performing the role of the devoted, concerned daughter-in-law for the staff to see. Mark, my son, would stand by the window checking his phone, his discomfort a palpable presence in the room. They would stay for exactly 20 minutes, then leave with expressions of profound relief, promising to come back soon. They were not visiting me. They were inspecting their investment, ensuring the problem they had solved remained solved. My only true human connection in that sterile place was a young nurse named Anna. She was different. She had tired eyes, but they were kind. She didn't speak to me in the overly sweet, condescending tone the others used. She spoke to me like a person. She would linger a few extra minutes after taking my blood pressure, telling me a funny story about her own stubborn grandmother. She was the one who noticed I never touched the bland puddings they served for dessert and started sneaking me small cups of real strong coffee from the staff room. Anna became my lifeline, a small window to a world where I was still a person, not just a patient. It was to Anna that I finally confessed my growing, gnawing anxiety. Not about my hip, but about my finances. Julia had taken over my checkbook and bank cards to manage my expenses while I was recovering. "It's just easier this way, Mom," she had said. But the bills from this place had to be astronomical, and my son's long-term unemployment was a secret I had kept for him for over a year. One night, as Anna was helping me settle in, I asked her for a favor. My voice, a low, ashamed whisper. I asked if she would help me access my bank account online using her tablet. She didn't question me. She simply nodded. We waited until the night shift was quiet. She brought her tablet to my room, the screen a bright, hopeful glow in the darkness. I gave her my login information, my hands trembling slightly. And then the page loaded. I saw the balance first, and a wave of nausea washed over me. It was significantly lower than it should have been. And then I saw the transactions. There it was, the monthly payment to the rehabilitation center, $14,500. But beneath it were other charges, a long, devastating list of my daughter-in-law's greed. A $6,200 charge from a luxury travel agency dated the week after my fall. A recurring monthly lease payment of $950 for a new SUV. Thousands of dollars in charges from high-end department stores and online boutiques. She wasn't just paying my bills with my money. She was systematically liquidating my life savings to fund the lavish lifestyle my son could no longer provide. I stared at the glowing screen, at the digital proof of their breathtaking betrayal. Anna placed a steadying hand on my arm, but I barely felt it. A new, much colder, much more terrifying thought was taking root in my mind, a suspicion that had been festering since the moment I saw Julia's cold, assessing eyes looking down at me on the floor. If she was capable of this calculated, cold-hearted theft, while I lay helpless in this bed, what else was she capable of? What had she been capable of that morning at the top of the stairs? The days following the discovery of my empty bank accounts were a quiet, cold hell. The financial betrayal was a sharp, clean wound. But the other suspicion, the darker one, the one about the fall itself, began to fester. I replayed that morning in my mind 1,000 times. The bunched-up rug, Julia's calm, assessing eyes. Had I imagined it? Was the grief and the shock making me paranoid? I became obsessed. The question, did she do this to me, became the silent, screaming engine of my days. This new grim purpose fueled my recovery. I pushed myself harder in physical therapy, my teeth gritted against the pain, driven by a new and terrible need. I did not just need to walk again. I needed to be strong enough to fight. And then I remembered. The security camera. My husband, ever cautious, had installed a small, discreet camera in the main hallway years ago, aimed at the front door and the bottom of the staircase. We had never really used it, but it was there, silently recording. The truth, I realized, was not just a memory. It was a digital file sitting on a hard drive in the house that was no longer my home. I knew I could not get it myself. I had to trust someone. I had to trust Anna. One night, after she had helped me with my evening medications, I asked her to stay. With my voice trembling, I told her everything. Not just the stolen money, but my terrible suspicion about the fall. I asked her for an impossible favor. I asked her to help me retrieve the footage. I saw the look of horror and then compassion in her young eyes. She didn't call me crazy. She believed me. Her brother, she told me, ran a small home security business. The plan we hatched was simple and terrifying. Anna told my son and daughter-in-law that the facility required a home safety assessment before I could be considered for eventual release, and that her brother's company was contracted to do it. It was a lie, of course, a beautiful, brave lie told on my behalf. Julia and Mark, eager to appear cooperative, agreed immediately. The day of the assessment was the longest of my life. I sat in my room staring at the clock, my hands clenched in my lap. I was helpless, a prisoner waiting for a message from the outside world. The hours ticked by. I imagined Anna's brother in my home, a stranger walking through my memories, trying to access the one truth that mattered. Anna came to my room late that night, long after her shift had ended. She did not say a word. She just sat beside me on the bed, her face pale, and placed her tablet in my hands. "I'm so sorry, Clara," she whispered. She pressed play. And there it was. The video was time-stamped from the morning of my fall. The hallway was empty, bathed in sunlight. Then Julia walked into the frame. She looked left, then right. Then, with a calm, deliberate motion, she nudged the Persian runner at the bottom of the stairs with the toe of her shoe, kicking it into a tangled, treacherous ridge. She looked at her work for a second, a flicker of something unreadable on her face, then turned and walked calmly back toward the kitchen. 10 minutes later, the footage showed me beginning my slow descent down the stairs. Anna reached out and switched off the tablet, plunging the room back into darkness. but I could still see it burned onto the back of my eyelids. The casual, calculated cruelty of my daughter-in-law's foot. The lie I had been living was so much worse, so much more monstrous than I could have ever imagined. I had not just been the victim of a tragic accident. I had not just been financially betrayed. I had been a target. The love I had once felt had curdled into something else, now something cold and hard and sharp as a shard of glass. They had not just put me in this home. They had tried to break me to get me here. And in the silent, humming darkness of that room, I made a new promise to myself. I would not just get my money back. I would get justice. The woman who woke up in the rehabilitation center the morning after seeing that video was not the same woman who had been admitted. The grief was gone. The confusion was gone. The quiet, aching sadness had been burned away, leaving behind something cold, hard, and unbreakable. I attacked my physical therapy with a new and ferocious determination. Each painful step on my healing hip was no longer just a step toward walking again. It was a step toward the courtroom door. Every exercise that brought a scream of pain to my lips was a silent vow. I was no longer just healing. I was arming myself. My one true ally in this was Anna. Her compassion had now been forged into a fierce loyalty. She helped me make the call to my lawyer, Anita, from the privacy of the nurses' lounge after midnight. My voice, when I spoke to Anita, did not tremble with the shame of a victim. It was the cold, precise voice of a witness. I told her about the financial fraud, and then I told her about the security footage. I described the calm, deliberate movement of my daughter-in-law's foot. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When Anita spoke again, her voice had changed. The professional concern had been replaced by a tone of cold, controlled fury. "Clara," she said, "this changes everything. This is no longer just a civil matter of financial fraud. This is a potential criminal case, assault, reckless endangerment." Her words did not frighten me. They validated me. The first strike was swift and silent. Anita drafted the legal paperwork immediately. Anna, my brave, wonderful Anna, printed the documents for me at the nurses' station. I signed them in my room, using my dinner tray as a desk, my hand as steady as a surgeon's. The documents granted Anita full power of attorney, revoking Julia's completely, and included a legal order to freeze every single one of my accounts. The financial pipeline that had been funding their lavish life was with the stroke of a pen and the click of a fax machine cut off. The fallout came 2 days later. It was not a phone call. It was a hurricane. Julia burst into my room without knocking her face blotchy and contorted with rage. Her mask of the caring, dutiful daughter-in-law had been incinerated. "What did you do?" she shrieked, waving her phone at me. "My cards are being declined. The accounts are frozen. How could you do this to us?" I did not stand. I remained seated in the armchair by the window, my hands resting calmly on the armrests. Anna, who had anticipated this, stood quietly by the door, a silent official witness. I looked at my daughter-in-law, at this stranger with a familiar face, and I did not feel fear. I felt nothing but a vast, cold pity. I let her rage for a full minute. When she finally paused to take a breath, I spoke, my voice quiet, but carrying across the room with the weight of a judge's gavel. "It's funny," I said, "that you are so concerned about your credit card, Julia. I, on the other hand, have been more concerned about my hip." She stared at me, confused. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the rug, Julia, I said, and I watched the color drain from her face. The rug at the bottom of the stairs. The security camera has a remarkably clear memory of that morning. I know what you did. She stood there, frozen, in the middle of my room. The anger over the money was gone, replaced by the raw, primal, and deeply satisfying terror of being caught. She had come here to demand an explanation for her financial inconvenience. She was now staring at the woman who held the proof of her monstrous, unforgivable act. The power had shifted completely and irrevocably. She was no longer my caretaker, and I was no longer her victim. I was the star witness to her crime, and the trial, I thought, was about to begin. Julia left my room that day not with the bluster of an angry woman, but with the shuffling, defeated gait of a criminal who has been caught. She did not look back. Anna and I sat in the silence. She left behind the unspoken horror of the video still hanging in the air between us. There was no sense of triumph, no satisfying thrill of victory. There was only the heavy, somber weight of a truth so ugly it felt like it had stained the very air in the room. I had not just uncovered a thief. I had unmasked a monster who wore my daughter-in-law's face. My son Mark arrived 2 days later. He came alone. I watched him walk down the long, sterile hallway of the rehabilitation center, and I saw a man I barely recognized. The confident, easygoing charm he had always worn was gone, replaced by the stooped shoulders and hollowed-out eyes of a man who had been utterly broken. He sat in the chair beside my bed, and for a long time, he said nothing. He just stared at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, broken whisper. He told me he had seen the video. He said Julia had confessed everything to him in a torrent of tears and panicked excuses. He did not ask me for forgiveness. He did not offer any defense for his wife or for his own willful blindness. He simply looked at me, his eyes full of a shame so profound it was almost difficult to witness. And he asked one question: "What do you want me to do, Mom?" It was a total and complete surrender. The power which they had stolen from me piece by piece was now handed back to me in its entirety. And with Anita's guidance, I had already decided what my terms would be. I laid them out for him not with anger, but with the cold, clear precision of a surgeon cutting away a sickness. First, they would cooperate fully with a forensic accountant to identify and return every single dollar that had been taken from my accounts. This would require the sale of their new car and any other assets they had acquired with my money. Second, they were to vacate my house. They had 1 week. I wanted it empty and professionally cleaned. I was reclaiming my home. He nodded, accepting each term without protest. And then I delivered the final, most important condition. I told him I had the evidence to press criminal charges against Julia for assault, an act that could send her to prison. I told him I would not do so on one condition: that I be granted temporary legal custody of my grandchildren, Leo and Maya. I would hire a full-time professional caregiver with my own money under my own terms to help me. I was not just taking back my house. I was securing the safety of the only 2 people in that family who were still innocent. He agreed to everything. There was no fight left in him. A week later, on a bright cold morning, I signed my own discharge papers. Anna drove me home. As we pulled into my driveway, a moving truck was pulling away, and my house stood before me, silent and empty. It looked smaller than I remembered, but more solid. I walked up the steps, leaning on my new cane, and I placed my own key into my own lock. The door swung open onto the quiet, sunlit rooms of my own life. The woman who had been carried out of this house on a stretcher was gone forever. The woman who walked back in, scarred but standing taller than she had in years, was someone new. She was the survivor. And this was no longer just a house. It was a sanctuary reclaimed and finally, truly safe. My first act as the rightful owner of my own home was to cleanse it. I hired a company to come and remove every piece of sleek, cold, minimalist furniture that Julia had chosen. I watched them carry out the gray sofa, the glass coffee table, the uncomfortable dining chairs. It was a reverse move in a deliberate and satisfying emptying. I brought my own things out of storage, my comfortable floral armchair, my late husband's sturdy oak bookshelves, the warm, worn rugs that held the history of my life in their threads. I was not just redecorating. I was restoring the soul of the house. The second act was to hire a woman named Maria, a kind professional caregiver in her 50s, with a warm smile and impeccable references. She now helps me with the heavy lifting, the driving, and the daily care of the grandchildren. Leo and Maya live with me now. My son and Julia visit them here in my home twice a week under supervision. The relationship is strained, clinical, an arrangement of lawyers and schedules. The healing, if it ever comes, will be a long and quiet road. But my focus is no longer on them. It is on the sound of my grandchildren's laughter in the backyard, a sound I fought for and won. My story, I suppose, is one of those dark grandma true stories that you hope is only fiction. A tale of lies and betrayal in the one place you are supposed to be safest. But I've learned that even the darkest grandma true stories can have a sunrise at the end of them if you are willing to fight your way through the night. Sharing our experiences like we do on Granny Stories is a vital part of that fight. It turns our private pain into a public lesson, a warning sign for others. My new life is quiet. It is built not on grand gestures, but on small, sturdy acts of self-preservation. My money is my own. My time is my own. My home is my own. All of these grandma true stories have a similar heart. I think they are about a woman who remembered that she was the original foundation of the house, not a temporary guest within its walls. I have lost a son perhaps for a time, perhaps forever, but I have gained myself. And in the quiet of my own safe house, I have learned that it was a worthy trade. Thank you for walking with me through this difficult chapter. If my story about reclaiming a safe harbor has resonated with you, I would be honored if you would share a piece of your own story in the comments below. The wisdom we share builds a safer place for us all. If you know someone who is fighting to feel safe in their own life, please feel free to share this story and to join this community of survivors and storytellers. Please consider subscribing to Granny Stories. Thank you for being here and be well.